Well, EPA's plan for biofuel blending obligations is getting mixed reaction from the industry. The agency proposed 15 billion gallons for 2022 requirements and said it will deny all pending small refinery exemptions. Well, President and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association, Jeff Cooper, joins us this morning with further perspective. And Jeff, as always, thanks for your time here today. So what are your thoughts on this proposal?
Well, thanks for having me this morning, Janet. And you're right, it really is a mixed bag. There's some good news and some bad news in what EPA released on Tuesday. We've been waiting for many of these items for more than a year. And in one afternoon, EPA really dumped a lot of stuff out there, and so we are still digesting it. But the good news is, like you said, EPA is proposing to require 15 billion gallons of conventional renewable fuel like corn ethanol in 2022. That's good. That's consistent with Congress's intent for the RFS. We think it helps get the RFS back on track for the future. EPA is also proposing to reject 65 pending petitions that had been filed by oil refineries who were looking for exemptions or a way out of their renewable fuel blending obligations. So this essentially means EPA is going to require those refiners to comply with the law and blend required volumes of renewable fuels. So that's the good news. The bad news is EPA is proposing to go back in time and retroactively reopen the 2020 RFS standards and lower those standards. And the reason they're doing that is they said, well, COVID affected the transportation fuel markets that year, and refiners just had a hard time blending the required volumes of renewable fuel. And we certainly disagree with that proposal, and we're going to be, taking a hard look at that. And if EPA ends up finalizing that kind of approach, we think it's likely they'll be challenged on it because we don't think what they're proposing to do is legally permissible for 2020.
Jeff, you've waited a lot of time for EPA to put this information out there, and of course these discrepancies that you just talked about. What kind of timeline are we looking at now before this is maybe now challenged and moving forward from there?
Yeah, so the important thing to remember is these are all proposals. EPA is suggesting to do these things, and so they give the public and stakeholders like us and farmers 60 days to comment on all of this. And so there will be a public hearing on January 4th. There will be a period where we can submit written comments to the agency, and then they'll take all that input, and based on what they hear from the public, they will finalize these rules. And if at that point they finalize this 2020 retroactive reopening, that's when the industry would have an opportunity to challenge that legally. So we're hopeful that in the next 60 days we can convince EPA to do the right thing and leave 2020 alone and just focus on looking forward with the renewable fuel standard and finalizing those good numbers that they proposed for 2022.
Now, Jeff, other big news out of Washington this week. The president has ordered federal vehicles and buildings to use renewable energy in an effort to make the government carbon neutral by 2050. What are your thoughts on that front?
Well, in theory, we think it's a great idea. In theory, we think the government should be using lower carbon fuels to power their vehicles and their fleets. But in practice, we're a little upset with the way that the Biden administration is proposing to do this. They're suggesting federal fleets can't buy any new liquid-fueled vehicles after 2035, and you got to buy electric vehicles, and we think that is a bad idea. We think it's the wrong way to go. If the goal is to reduce carbon emissions, there are ways to do that with liquid fuels. And the most obvious way is to blend more ethanol and use flex fuel vehicles. And so we're going to be pushing the administration to allow a role for flex fuel vehicles and other vehicles that can run on higher blends of renewable fuels, because that can accomplish the same goals that they're trying to accomplish with electric vehicles.
All right. Well, Jeff, as always, thanks for your insight. President and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association, Jeff Cooper. You can go online to ethanolrfa.org for additional insight.